They were supposed to build, not kill, and that single misunderstanding would cost the enemy everything. When the first American landing craft slammed into the reef-choked shoreline under a boiling sky, Japanese defenders peered through firing slits and binoculars, expecting waves of riflemen charging forward in textbook assaults. Instead, they saw something that looked almost absurd. Men jumped into the surf carrying toolkits instead of extra ammunition. Others wrestled with cables, surveying poles, welding gear, and crates of equipment clearly meant for construction, not combat. Behind them, hulking bulldozers and graders rumbled forward like misplaced farm machines dragged into a nightmare. Laughter spread through some of the pillboxes. These were not warriors, they thought. These were laborers. The Japanese gunners opened fire anyway, because everything that moved on that beach had to die, but deep down many believed this landing would break quickly. No army sent construction workers into hell, unless it was already desperate. The surf turned red almost immediately. Mortar shells crashed into the water, lifting men and equipment into the air before dropping them back in pieces. Machine gun fire stitched long lines across the sand, cutting down anyone who hesitated for even a second. The Seabees members of the U.S. Navy construction battalions had trained for chaos, but no training truly prepared a man for stepping off a ramp into bullets. Some went under with their packs dragging them down, never to resurface. Others clawed forward through waist-deep water, lungs burning, ears ringing, gripping whatever they could carry. There was no dramatic charge, no heroic music playing in their heads. There was only noise, fear, and the stubborn instinct to keep moving because stopping meant dying where you stood. The Japanese pillboxes were masterpieces of defense. Thick concrete reinforced with steel, half buried into coral ridges angled to sweep the beach with. Overlapping fire. Marines tried to advance and were shredded. Grenades bounced off hardened walls. Rifle fire did nothing. Even light artillery struggled to hit firing ports no wider than a man's helmet. The beach became a killing ground measured in yards gained and lives lost. Marines hugged the sand, pinned down, screaming for anything that could silence the guns. The enemy had built these fortifications to survive weeks of bombardment and direct assault. And on that first brutal day, they were doing exactly what they were designed to do. Amid the chaos, the Seabees kept working. They were not oblivious to the carnage around them. They simply processed danger differently. These men had built airstrips under fire before, had repaired docks. While bombs fell, had learned that panic wasted precious seconds. Their eyes scanned terrain instead of kill zones. They noticed the angle of slopes, the composition of sand and coral, the way the pillboxes were set into the earth. While Marines cursed the concrete and bullets, Seabees were already thinking in terms of leverage, weight, and force. Construction was about overcoming resistance, and this battlefield was just another impossible job, only louder and far deadlier. A bulldozer near the waterline took a direct hit and burst into flames, its operator thrown clear and killed instantly. Another stalled as bullets shredded its exposed engine. For a moment, it looked as though the machines would be useless wreck, obstacles littering the beach alongside bodies and broken gear. But one dozer, its blades scarred and smoking, kept moving. The operator, a man who had once built highways back home, lowered his head and pushed forward, gripping the controls so hard his knuckles went white. Bullets rang against steel like thrown gravel. He could see the pillbox ahead, could feel the machine straining as if alive beneath him. Every instinct screamed to turn away, but he knew that behind him Marines were dying, trapped by that concrete monster. As the bulldozer crawled closer, Japanese gunners focused their fire on it, sensing danger too late. The blade slammed into the sand at the base of the pillbox, shoving earth upward in a violent wave. Sand poured into firing slits, choking guns and men alike. Inside the bunker, defenders shouted in alarm, firing blindly as their view disappeared. The bulldozer did not stop. It climbed, blade rising, dumping tons of sand and coral onto the roof and openings, sealing the structure like a tomb. Smoke and dust filled the air. When the machine finally reversed, the pillbox was silent, its guns buried, its occupants trapped in suffocating darkness. Marines stared in disbelief. What artillery and grenades could not do in hours had been accomplished in minutes by raw force and ingenuity. Shouts went up, part shock, part savage relief. Another bulldozer surged forward, then another. Seabees began coordinating without orders, pointing, signaling, reading the ground as naturally as breathing. They learned quickly which angles worked best, how much material was needed, how to approach without exposing the operator for too long. Each run was still a gamble with death, but now it was a gamble with purpose. The Japanese tried to adapt. They shifted fire, aimed for operators, concentrated on disabling tracks and blades. Snipers targeted exposed cabs. Mortars bracketed the machines. Still, the bulldozers came. When one was destroyed, another took its place. Some operators were wounded and kept going anyway, blood dripping onto controls, faces set with grim determination. The noise was overwhelming, engines roaring, bullets hammering metal, explosions tearing at the ground. But beneath it all was a new sound, one that terrified the defenders more than gunfire, the steady, unstoppable advance of machines designed to reshape the earth itself. As more pillboxes were buried, the battlefield changed. Marines advanced behind the moving walls of steel and sand, using the dozers as shields, firing into any opening that remained. The Japanese defensive line, once rigid and confident, began to fracture. Bunkers that could not be easily buried were isolated, cut off, rendered useless as surrounding positions vanished. The beachhead expanded, yard by bloody yard, not through brute infantry assault alone, but through the cold logic of construction applied to war. By late afternoon, the sun hung low, casting long shadows over a beach, transformed into something unrecognizable. What had been a killing field that morning was now a scarred landscape of churned sand, shattered concrete, and half-buried fortifications. Seabees sat on bulldozer blades, exhausted, ears ringing, hands trembling as adrenaline drained away. They had not come ashore planning to fight like this. No manual had taught them to turn earth-moving equipment into weapons of terror. They had simply adapted because adaptation was survival. Word spread quickly among both sides. Marines spoke of the Seabees with awe, calling them madmen, heroes, saviors. Japanese soldiers whispered warnings, fear creeping into voices hardened by years of war. These were not ordinary troops. These men did not attack fortifications, they erased them. Concrete and steel, once symbols of invincibility, meant nothing again. Relentless machines and men who refused to see obstacles as permanent. As darkness approached, sporadic gunfire echoed from the interior, but the beach belonged to the Americans now. The Seabees cleaned weapons they had barely fired, checked machines that looked like they had crawled through hell itself, and prepared to work again at first light. Tomorrow there would be airstrips to build, roads to carve, supplies to move, but everyone there knew the truth that had been carved into the sand that day. The enemy had laughed at construction workers landing under fire, and in doing so had sealed their own fate. The Seabees had proven that on a battlefield anything could become a weapon. Sometimes the most dangerous men were the ones who knew how to build, not just destroy. The bulldozers did not roar forward out of bravery alone, but out of necessity, because by the time the Seabees committed fully, retreat was no longer an option for anyone on that beach. The Marines, pinned down behind shallow scrapes in the sand, could feel every second stretching into eternity as machine gun rounds cracked overhead and slammed into the earth inches away. Sweat mixed with grit on their faces. Radio calls overlapped in frantic bursts, calling for fire that could not reach the concrete monsters ahead. The Japanese pillboxes were still alive, still spitting death, and every moment they remained standing meant more bodies on the shoreline. When the Seabees brought the bulldozers forward again, this time in deliberate sequence, it felt less like improvisation and more like the opening move of a brutal new doctrine. Each operator knew his role now. One machine would draw fire, moving just enough to pull attention, while another crept in from a slight angle, blade low, engine screaming under the strain. Seabees on foot ran alongside, rifles slung awkwardly as they guided drivers with frantic hand signals, pointing out hidden dips, mines, and firing ports. They were exposed, horribly exposed, yet they moved with a focus that bordered on calm. Training had drilled into them that hesitation killed projects. On this battlefield, projects were measured in lives saved or lost. Every buried pillbox opened a path forward, and every path forward meant the invasion might actually survive the day. Inside the Japanese defenses, confusion spread rapidly. Their carefully plotted fields of fire were being neutralized not by superior firepower, but by terrain denial. Guns choked on sand. Vision vanished behind collapsing earth. Men who had sworn to die at their posts suddenly found themselves suffocate in total darkness, pounding on concrete walls that no longer had exits. Officers shouted orders that no longer made sense, because the enemy was not attacking in any way they had prepared for. Defensive doctrine crumbled alongside the pillboxes themselves. One bulldozer took a direct hit from an anti-tank gun concealed farther inland. The explosion flipped the machine onto its side, killing the operator instantly. The blast sent fragments of steel scything through nearby Seabees, wounding several. For a brief moment, everything froze. Smoke curled upward. The roar of engines faltered. Then another dozer lurched past the wreck without stopping. The operator did not look at the body or the burning machine. He stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, hands steady. The message was clear to everyone watching. The work would continue no matter the cost. The Japanese intensified their fire, focusing on the bulldozers as primary targets. Snipers aimed for exposed operators. Mortars dropped dangerously close, showering machines with dirt and shrapnel. Yet, the very act of concentrating fire gave Marines breathing room. With guns redirected, infantry surged forward in short, desperate rushes, closing distance that had seemed impossible hours earlier. The battlefield rhythm shifted. Instead of static slaughter, movement returned, chaotic but real, and movement meant hope. As the Seabees advanced, they refined their method. Some pillboxes were best buried from the front, others from the sides, depending on how they were set into the coral. In places where earth was too shallow, bulldozers piled wreckage and debris against firing slits, sealing them by brute force. In other areas, they collapsed the ground around bunkers, causing structures to crack and settle, rendering weapons useless. It was not elegant warfare, but it was devastatingly effective. The island itself became a tool, reshaped moment by moment to serve survival. The psychological impact was immense. Marines who had been moments from breaking found renewed strength, watching enemy fortifications vanish under waves of sand. Shouts of encouragement echoed along the line. Seabees, once regarded as support personnel, were now treated like frontline shock troops. There was no time for formal recognition, only quick nods, slapped shoulders shared. Canteens passed between men who understood they were rewriting the rules together. Japanese resistance did not collapse immediately. In some bunkers, defenders fought until their last breath, firing through narrow gaps until sand finally silenced them. In others, grenades were thrown desperately at bulldozers, bouncing uselessly off blades or detonating harmlessly in loose earth. A few attempted suicidal charges bursting from hidden exits, only to be cut down by Marines waiting behind the machines. Courage existed on both sides, but courage alone could not stop what was happening. The Seabees were not engaging in a duel, they were dismantling a system. As afternoon wore on, exhaustion set in. Operators swapped out when they could, though replacements were just as tired. Hands blistered from controls, ears rang continuously, throats burned from dust and smoke. Still, the bulldozers moved. When fuel ran low, Seabees ran cans forward under fire. When blades jammed, men crawled beneath machines to clear debris while bullets snapped overhead. There was no heroism in their minds, only obligation. The job was not finished, and unfinished jobs were dangerous. Gradually, the firing from the beachfront pillboxes dwindled. The line that had once seemed unbreakable now existed only in broken segments, isolated and ineffective. Marines pushed inland, encountering resistance, but no longer the impenetrable wall that had slaughtered them earlier. The beach had widened enough to bring in heavier equipment and supplies. The gamble had worked. What began as desperate improvisation had become the decisive factor of the landing. As dusk approached, a strange quiet settled over parts of the beach. Engines idled instead of screamed. Occasional shots echoed from farther inland, but the immediate killing ground was finally still. Seabees climbed down from machines that looked decades older than they had that morning. They leaned against blades, sat in the sand, or simply lay where they stood, too exhausted to move. Some stared at their hands, still shaking, as if trying to convince themselves they were real. Others looked out over the half-buried concrete shapes scattered across the shoreline, hardly believing that hours earlier those same structures had been instruments of terror. No formal orders marked the end of the fighting for them. There was no ceremony, no speeches. A Marine passed a cigarette to a Seabee. A canteen was shared. A brief laugh escaped someone, sharp and unexpected, then faded quickly. The cost was obvious. All around them, machines destroyed, friends missing, bodies still lying where they had fallen. Victory felt heavy, not triumphant. Yet beneath the exhaustion and grief was a quiet certainty. Without what they had done, the beach would have been lost. That night, as darkness wrapped the island, the Japanese attempted counterattacks, probing cautiously, unsure of what new horror awaited them. They no longer trusted their fortification. They no longer believed concrete could save them. The sound of engines starting anywhere nearby sent fear rippling through their ranks, because it meant the Americans were coming not with grenades or flamethrowers, but with the unstoppable force of machines that erased hiding places entirely. The Seabees slept in short, uneasy stretches, often beside their bulldozers, hands resting on cold steel as if it were a living companion. Tomorrow there would be more work. There always was. Airstrips had to be carved out of jungle. Roads had to be cut through impossible terrain. War did not pause for reflection, but as the island settled into uneasy quiet, one truth had been hammered into the earth as deeply as any buried pillbox. The men labeled just construction workers had changed the outcome of the battle, not by abandoning who they were, but by using exactly what they knew best. They did not need to become soldiers in the traditional sense. They had brought their own kind of power to the fight, and it had proven more terrifying than anyone had imagined. Night did not bring peace to the island, only a different kind of tension, one that pressed down on every man who lay in the sand listening to distant gunfire and the restless sounds of the jungle. The Seabees slept beside their battered machines, helmets pulled low, rifles within reach, boots still on, because no one believed they would be allowed true rest. Somewhere inland, Japanese troops regrouped, whispering plans in the darkness, still trying to understand how their strongest defenses had been swallowed by earth and steel. For the first time since the war had reached these islands, concrete no longer felt permanent, and that realization gnawed at them far worse than hunger or fear of death. At first light, the Seabees were awake before orders came. Habit and instinct drove them. Engines coughed, then growled back to life, echoing across the torn beach. Marines moving forward glanced back at the sound and felt something close to comfort. Those machines meant progress. They meant survival. The battlefield inland was different from the open beach, thick jungle, coral ridges, tangled roots, and more hidden bunkers cunningly disguised beneath foliage. Japanese engineers had spent months turning the island into a fortress designed to bleed attackers slowly. What they had not planned for was an enemy who could reshape the island itself. The first inland pillbox revealed itself when a marine patrol was cut down in seconds by sudden fire from what looked like a solid hillside. The familiar pattern returned instantly. Marines hit the ground. Bullets snapped through leaves. Shouts for support crackled over radios. Within minutes, a bulldozer clawed its way forward, pushing aside trees like matchsticks. The operator could barely see through hanging vines and drifting smoke, but he followed. Hand signals from Seabees moving ahead of him, machetes and rifles working together. When the firing slit appeared, it was already too late for those inside. Earth and shattered roots poured in, sealing another strong point in suffocating silence. Word spread rapidly along the American line. Wherever the Seabees went, resistance collapsed faster. Marines began calling for bulldozers as urgently as they called for ammunition. Officers who had once viewed construction units as secondary assets now treated Seabee commanders as essential partners in every advance. Plans changed on the fly. Instead of grinding frontal assaults, attacks were shaped around terrain manipulation. Jungle paths became roads. Hills were carved down. Defensive positions were erased rather than assaulted. The psychological toll on the Japanese defenders deepened with every hour. Survivors spoke of an enemy that did not fight like men, but like an unstoppable force of nature. You could shoot at it, wound it, even destroy parts of it, but it kept coming, reshaping the world around you until hiding was impossible. Soldiers began abandoning pillboxes before they were even engaged, retreating deeper inland where the jungle felt safer than concrete. It was a mistake. The jungle, too, could be bulldozed. The Seabees did not feel invincible. They felt tired beyond anything they had known. Hands blistered and bled, eyes burned from smoke and dust. Some men operated machines for hours without realizing they were wounded, only noticing blood when it dripped onto controls. Loss followed them closely. Every destroyed bulldozer meant a dead or wounded friend. Every advance past fresh bodies, American and Japanese alike, reminders of the cost carved into the soil. Yet they kept moving, because stopping meant leaving others exposed. As days passed, the beachhead transformed into something resembling order. Airstrips began to take shape where jungle had stood. Supply dumps appeared. Roads snaked inland, cut by the same machines that had buried pillboxes. Planes landed sooner than anyone had expected, bringing reinforcement and supplies that ensured the island would not be lost again. The Seabees returned to what they had always done best, building. But now every shovel of dirt, every leveled stretch of ground carried the memory of how that same work had saved lives under fire. The Japanese launched counterattacks, often at night, driven by desperation and honor. They charged into machine gun fire, attempted infiltration, and tried to destroy equipment with explosives. Sometimes they succeeded. A bulldozer would vanish in flame, its silhouette etched briefly against the darkness. The Seabees mourned quickly and got back to work. There was no room for long grief. War did not allow it. Still, names were remembered. Faces lingered in memory. Every machine lost hardened their resolve. Gradually resistance weakened. Food ran out for the defenders. Ammunition dwindled. Disease and exhaustion spread. The island that had been meant to be a fortress became a trap. Japanese soldiers who surrendered spoke with disbelief about the bulldozers, about watching their strongest positions vanish beneath earth. Some admitted they had believed Americans were soft, incapable of enduring hardship. That illusion lay buried alongside the pillboxes. When the fighting finally faded into scattered skirmishes, the island stood changed forever. Scars ran across it where machines had passed. Concrete ruins jutted from the ground like broken bones. Airstrips stretched across land once choked by jungle. The Seabees moved through this transformed landscape with quiet pride and lingering fatigue. There were no parades, no headlines waiting for them. Their work was already shifting elsewhere, demanded by the relentless push of the war. Months later, as the campaign moved on and new islands fell, stories spread among American forces. They spoke of the Seabees who drove bulldozers into gunfire, who buried enemy alive when no other option remained, who turned construction into a weapon. New recruits listened wide-eyed, unsure whether to believe such tales. Veterans nodded silently. They knew every word was true. Long after the war ended, those who survived returned home to jobs that looked nothing like battle. They built highways, schools, and neighborhoods. They operated machines without bullets striking steel. without the smell of smoke and blood. To outsiders, they were just construction workers again. But sometimes, when an engine roared to life or earth shifted beneath a blade, memories returned uninvited. They remembered a beach where laughter had turned into terror, where men underestimate them, and where building and destroying had become the same act. The world remembers victories through generals and battles, through dates and flags planted in soil. It rarely remembers the men who shaped the ground itself, who fought with us, seeking glory, who did their jobs under fire because someone had to. Yet, the truth remains, written into the history of the Pacific and into the bones of those islands. When the Seabees arrived, the rules changed. They were never just construction workers. They were the men who proved that ingenuity could be deadlier than any weapon, and that sometimes the power to build was the most devastating force of all.